Hey everyone, I'm Horror Horizon, and I'm here to keep you company tonight. I know many of you use these videos to fall asleep, but be warned, tonight's story might just keep you awake. Before we begin, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Also, drop a comment letting me know where you're from and what time you're watching right now. Now, get comfortable, relax, and let's dive into a story that might send chills down your spine. And if you've ever experienced a real-life horror story, we'd love to hear it. Email us your story, and who knows? It might just be featured in a future video. Now, let's begin. Chicago, 1952. The wind howled through the empty streets of Chicago, carrying with it the faint scent of rain and decay. The city was growing, its skyline stretching ever upward, but beneath its bustling surface lay secrets it had tried to forget. In the shadow of progress, the Blackwood Asylum stood as a grim reminder of a darker time. The asylum was a monolithic structure, its brick walls cracked and ivy-choked, its windows boarded up like blind eyes. Inside, the air was thick with the stench of mildew and despair. The halls, once filled with the cries of the tormented, were now silent, save for the faint creak of rusted hinges and the occasional scurrying of rats. In the depths of the asylum, Dr. Elias Blackwood paced the floor of his laboratory. His once pristine white coat was stained with blood and soot, his hair disheveled, and his eyes wild with a mixture of desperation and madness. Around him, the walls were lined with shelves of jars containing preserved organs, their contents floating in murky liquid. Diagrams and notes were pinned haphazardly to the walls, their contents incomprehensible to anyone but him. Tonight was the culmination of years of work. Dr. Blackwood had always believed that the mind was a prison, and he had dedicated his life to freeing it, no matter the cost. His experiments had pushed the boundaries of science and morality, lobotomies, electroshock therapy, and the use of hallucinogenic drugs to purify the mind. But his latest endeavor was his most ambitious yet. He called it soul transference. In the center of the room stood a massive, spiral-shaped apparatus, its metal arms twisted like the branches of a dead tree. At its base was a chair, its restraints stained with the blood of countless patients. Dr. Blackwood believed that by merging the living with the dead, he could create a bridge between worlds, a way to transcend the limitations of the human mind. But something had gone wrong. The patient strapped to the chair, a young man with hollow eyes and a gaunt face, screamed as the machine hummed to life. The air crackled with energy, and the spiral symbol etched into the floor began to glow with an eerie, pulsating light. Shadows danced on the walls, twisting and contorting into grotesque shapes. Dr. Blackwood watched in horror as the patient's body convulsed, his eyes rolling back into his head. The machine's hum grew louder, drowning out the screams, until it reached a deafening crescendo. Then, with a blinding flash of light, it stopped. The patient was dead. But the room was no longer empty. Shadowy figures began to materialize, their forms flickering like static on a broken television. They were the patients, those who had died under Dr. Blackwood's care, and they were no longer bound by the laws of the living. Their eyes glowed with a malevolent light, and their whispers filled the air, a cacophony of anger and despair. Dr. Blackwood stumbled backward, his face pale with terror. He had succeeded in bridging the gap between the living and the dead, but at a terrible cost. The asylum was no longer a place of science, it was a prison for the damned. The city officials arrived the next day, summoned by reports of strange lights and screams emanating from the asylum. They found Dr. Blackwood's body in the laboratory, his face frozen in a mask of horror. The asylum was sealed off, its entrance buried beneath tons of concrete and rubble as the city expanded above it. But some doors should never be opened. The abandoned subway tunnel was a relic of a bygone era, its walls covered in graffiti and its tracks rusted and overgrown with weeds. The air was damp and heavy, carrying the faint scent of mildew and decay. Mia adjusted the strap of her backpack, her flashlight cutting through the darkness as she led the way. Behind her, Jake fiddled with his handheld scanner, its screen flickering with static, while Sarah trailed behind, her camera clicking as she documented their journey. "Are you sure this is the right way?" Sarah asked, her voice echoing off the tunnel walls. She adjusted the lens of her camera, her skepticism evident in the way she frowned at the crumbling infrastructure around them. "Positive," Jake replied, his eyes glued to the scanner. "According to the old city blueprints, this tunnel connects to a network of underground passages. If we're lucky, we might even find something that hasn't been touched in decades." Mia glanced over her shoulder, her sharp features illuminated by the beam of her flashlight. "And if we're unlucky?" Jake grinned. "Then we'll have one hell of a story to tell." Mia rolled her eyes but couldn't suppress a small smile. She had always been the practical one, the leader who kept the group grounded. But even she couldn't deny the thrill of discovery that came with urban exploration. It was why she had started doing this in the first place, to escape the monotony of everyday life and uncover the secrets buried beneath the city. The group pressed on, their footsteps echoing in the silence. The tunnel seemed to stretch on forever, its walls closing in around them. Mia's flashlight flickered, and she smacked it against her palm, cursing under her breath. "You know," Sarah said, her tone laced with sarcasm, "this is exactly how every horror movie starts. A group of idiots wanders into a dark, creepy place, and then they find something amazing," Jake interrupted, his voice brimming with excitement. He pointed to a section of the wall where the bricks had crumbled away, revealing a hidden passage. "Look at this." Mia stepped closer, shining her flashlight into the opening. The passage was narrow, barely wide enough for a single person to squeeze through, but it was there. She exchanged a glance with Jake, her heart racing with anticipation. "What do you think?" Jake asked, his eyes gleaming with excitement. Mia hesitated, her practical side warring with her curiosity. "It could be dangerous. We don't know what's down there." "That's the point," Jake said, grinning. "Come on, Mia. When have we ever backed down from a challenge?" Sarah crossed her arms, her camera dangling from her neck. "I'm with Mia on this one. Something about this place feels off." Mia studied the passage, her mind racing. She had always been the one to take risks, to push the boundaries of what was possible. But this time, something felt different. The air was heavier, the silence more oppressive. It was as if the tunnel itself was warning them to turn back. But then she thought of her brother, who had been lost to the depths of mental illness, and the unanswered questions that still haunted her. If there was even a chance of uncovering something meaningful, she couldn't walk away. "We'll go in," Mia said finally, her voice firm. "But we stick together, and if anything feels wrong, we leave immediately." "Agreed?" Jake nodded eagerly, while Sarah sighed in resignation. "Agreed. But if we die down here, I'm haunting both of you." The group squeezed through the narrow passage, their flashlights illuminating the way. The air grew colder as they descended, the walls closing in around them. The passage opened into a larger chamber, its ceiling supported by crumbling arches. And then they saw it. A massive iron door, its surface rusted and covered in strange symbols, stood at the far end of the chamber. Above it, barely visible beneath layers of grime, was a sign, "Blackwood Asylum." Mia's breath caught in her throat. She had heard the rumors, of course, whispers of an asylum that had been buried beneath the city, its secrets lost to time. But she had never imagined they would actually find it. Jake stepped forward, his scanner beeping furiously. "This is it," he said, his voice trembling with excitement. "This is the entrance to Blackwood Asylum." Sarah raised her camera, snapping a photo of the door. The flash illuminated the chamber, casting long shadows on the walls. When she lowered the camera, her expression was unreadable. "We shouldn't be here," she said quietly. Mia hesitated, her hand hovering over the door's handle. She could feel the weight of the moment, the gravity of what they were about to do. But she also felt something else, a pull, as if the asylum itself was calling to her. "We've come this far," she said finally, her voice steady. "We can't turn back now." With a deep breath, she pushed the door open, its hinges screeching in protest. The air that rushed out was cold and stale, carrying with it the faint scent of decay. The group stepped inside, their flashlights cutting through the darkness. The asylum was exactly as it had been left, decaying and forgotten, its halls filled with the echoes of the past. But as they ventured deeper, they began to realize that they were not alone. Something was watching them. The air inside the asylum was thick and oppressive, carrying the faint scent of mildew and something else, something metallic, like blood. Mia's flashlight flickered as she swept it across the room, revealing cracked walls, peeling paint, and rusted medical equipment. The floor was littered with debris, broken chairs, shattered glass, and yellowed papers scattered like leaves in the wind. "This place is a goldmine," Jake whispered, his voice tinged with awe. He knelt to pick up one of the papers, brushing off the dust to reveal a patient record. The handwriting was faded but legible, detailing treatments that made his stomach churn. "Lobotomies, electroshock therapy, experimental drugs," Jake muttered, his eyes scanning the page. "This is insane. They were torturing people here." Sarah shivered, her camera clicking as she documented the scene. "I don't like this. It feels wrong." Mia nodded, her grip tightening on her flashlight. She couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. The shadows seemed to shift at the edges of her vision, and the whispers, faint, almost imperceptible, echoed in the distance. "Let's keep moving," she said, her voice steady despite the unease gnawing at her. "Stay close." The group ventured deeper into the asylum, their footsteps echoing in the silence. The halls were a maze of crumbling walls and rusted doors, each one marked with numbers and symbols that made no sense. Mia's flashlight flickered again, and she smacked it against her palm, cursing under her breath. "Great," Sarah muttered. "If the ghosts don't get us, the darkness will." Jake ignored her, his attention focused on a door at the end of the hall. It was slightly ajar, the wood splintered and warped with age. He pushed it open, revealing a small office. The desk was covered in dust, its surface littered with papers and books. "Jackpot," Jake said, stepping inside. He picked up a leather-bound journal, its cover embossed with the name Dr. Elias Blackwood. Mia and Sarah followed him in, their flashlights illuminating the room. The walls were lined with shelves filled with jars, each one containing something that made Sarah's stomach turn. Preserved organs floated in murky liquid, their shapes distorted and grotesque. "What the hell is this?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling. Jake didn't answer. He was too engrossed in the journal, his eyes scanning the pages with growing horror. "This is unbelievable. Dr. Blackwood wasn't just experimenting on patients. He was trying to merge the living with the dead." Mia leaned over his shoulder, her flashlight illuminating the page. The handwriting was frantic, the words barely legible. "The spiral is the key. It binds the living to the dead, the mind to the soul. But the cost is too great. They are here. They are watching. We cannot leave." As Mia read the words aloud, the temperature in the room dropped. Their breath became visible, and the whispers grew louder, overlapping into a cacophony of voices. "Did you hear that?" Sarah asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Mia nodded, her heart pounding in her chest. She turned her flashlight toward the door, the beam cutting through the darkness. For a moment, she thought she saw something, a shadowy figure, its eyes glowing faintly, but it was gone before she could be sure. "We need to get out of here," Mia said, her voice firm. Jake shook his head, his eyes still glued to the journal. "Not yet. There's more here. We need to understand what happened." "Jake," Sarah said, her voice rising in panic. "Something's not right. We need to leave. Now." Before Jake could respond, the door slammed shut with a deafening crash. The group froze, their flashlights flickering as the whispers grew louder. The shadows seemed to close in around them, their shapes twisting and contorting into something unrecognizable. Mia grabbed the journal from Jake's hands and shoved it into her backpack. "We're leaving. Now." She yanked the door open, the hinges screeching in protest. The hall outside was darker than before, the air thick with the scent of decay. The group moved quickly, their flashlights cutting through the darkness as they retraced their steps. But the asylum had other plans. The corridors seemed to shift, the walls closing in around them. Doors that had been open were now shut, and the whispers grew louder, more insistent. Mia's flashlight flickered again, and this time it didn't come back on. "Great," Sarah muttered, her voice trembling. "Just great." Jake's flashlight was the only one still working, its beam cutting through the darkness. He led the way, his scanner beeping furiously as they navigated the maze of halls. "This way," he said, his voice filled with false confidence. But as they turned the corner, they found themselves in a large, circular room. The walls were lined with rusted medical equipment, and in the center of the room was a chair, its restraint stained with dried blood. The spiral symbol was etched into the floor beneath the chair, its lines jagged and uneven. It pulsed faintly, as if alive. "What is that?" Sarah asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Before anyone could answer, the temperature dropped again. The whispers grew louder, overlapping into a deafening roar. The group turned their flashlights toward the source of the noise, their beams illuminating a figure in a tattered doctor's coat. Dr. Elias Blackwood. His eyes were hollow, his face twisted into a grotesque smile. He spoke in a guttural voice, the words echoing in the silence. "You shouldn't have come. Now you belong to them." The figure of Dr. Elias Blackwood stood motionless, his hollow eyes fixed on the group. His tattered coat hung loosely from his skeletal frame, and his face was a mask of decay, frozen in a grotesque smile. The air around him seemed to shimmer, as if he were not entirely solid, a specter caught between worlds. Mia's heart pounded in her chest, her breath visible in the freezing air. She took a step back, her flashlight trembling in her hand. "What the hell is that?" "It's him," Jake whispered, his voice filled with a mixture of awe and terror. "Dr. Blackwood." Sarah raised her camera, her hands shaking as she snapped a photo. The flash illuminated the room, casting long shadows on the walls. When the light faded, Dr. Blackwood was gone. "Where did he go?" Sarah asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The whispers returned, louder now, overlapping into a cacophony of voices. The group turned their flashlights toward the source of the noise, their beams cutting through the darkness. The shadows seemed to shift and twist, their shapes forming into grotesque figures that loomed just beyond the edge of the light. "We need to get out of here," Mia said, her voice firm despite the fear gnawing at her. Jake nodded, his scanner beeping furiously. "This way." He led the group toward the door, but as they approached, it slammed shut with a deafening crash. The whispers grew louder, the voices overlapping into a deafening roar. The temperature dropped again, and the spiral symbol on the floor began to glow faintly, its lines pulsing with an eerie light. Mia grabbed the door handle, yanking it with all her strength, but it wouldn't budge. It stuck. Sarah turned her flashlight toward the walls, her beam illuminating the rusted medical equipment. The shadows seemed to move on their own, their shapes twisting and contorting into something unrecognizable. "What do we do?" Sarah asked, her voice rising in panic. Before anyone could answer, the whispers stopped. The room fell silent, the air thick with tension. Then, from the darkness, came a single voice, a child's voice, soft and pleading. "Help me." Mia's blood ran cold. She turned her flashlight toward the source of the voice, her beam illuminating a small figure standing in the corner of the room. It was a girl, no older than 10, her dress tattered and her face pale. Her eyes were hollow, her expression filled with despair. "Who are you?" Mia asked, her voice trembling. The girl didn't answer. She simply stared at Mia, her hollow eyes filled with a sadness that made Mia's chest ache. Then, without warning, the girl vanished, her form dissolving into the shadows. "What the hell is going on?" Sarah asked, her voice filled with panic. Jake shook his head, his scanner beeping furiously. "I don't know, but we need to get out of here. Now." Mia turned back to the door, yanking the handle with all her strength. This time, it opened with a loud creak, the hinges screeching in protest. The group didn't hesitate. They rushed through the door, their flashlights cutting through the darkness as they navigated the maze of halls. But the asylum had other plans. The corridors seemed to shift, the walls closing in around them. Doors that had been open were now shut, and the whispers returned, louder and more insistent. Mia's flashlight flickered again, and this time it didn't come back on. "Great," Sarah muttered, her voice trembling. "Just great." Jake's flashlight was the only one still working, its beam cutting through the darkness. He led the way, his scanner beeping furiously as they navigated the maze of halls. "This way," he said, his voice filled with false confidence. But as they turned the corner, they found themselves back in the circular room. The spiral symbol on the floor pulsed faintly, its lines jagged and uneven. The chair in the center of the room was now occupied by Dr. Blackwood. His hollow eyes fixed on the group, his grotesque smile widening. He spoke in a guttural voice, the words echoing in the silence. "You cannot leave. You belong to them now." The air in the circular room grew colder, the spiral symbol on the floor pulsing with an eerie, otherworldly light. Dr. Blackwood's hollow eyes bore into the group, his grotesque smile widening as he repeated his chilling words. "You cannot leave. You belong to them now." Mia's heart raced, her mind scrambling for a way out. She glanced at Jake and Sarah, their faces pale with fear. "We need to split up," she said, her voice steady despite the terror clawing at her chest. "We'll cover more ground that way." "Are you insane?" Sarah hissed, her camera trembling in her hands. "Splitting up is the worst thing we could do." "We don't have a choice," Mia shot back. "This place is messing with us. If we stay together, we'll just keep going in circles." Jake nodded reluctantly, his scanner beeping erratically. "She's right. We'll meet back here in 10 minutes. If anyone finds a way out, we signal the others." Sarah opened her mouth to protest, but the whispers returned, louder and more insistent. The shadows around them seemed to shift and twist, their forms taking on grotesque shapes. Without another word, the group split up, each of them venturing down a different corridor. Mia moved quickly, her flashlight cutting through the darkness as she navigated the maze of halls. The air grew colder with every step, her breath visible in the dim light. She tried to ignore the whispers, but they grew louder, overlapping into a cacophony of voices. She turned a corner and found herself in a long, narrow room. The walls were lined with mirrors, their surfaces cracked and fogged with age. As she stepped inside, the door slammed shut behind her, the sound echoing in the silence. Mia's heart pounded as she turned her flashlight toward the mirrors. Her reflection stared back at her, but something was wrong. The reflection's eyes were hollow, its expression filled with despair. "What the hell?" Mia whispered, her voice trembling. The reflection moved on its own, its lips curling into a grotesque smile. It raised a hand, pressing it against the glass. Mia stumbled backward, her flashlight slipping from her grasp. It hit the floor, the beam flickering before going out completely. The room was plunged into darkness, the only light coming from the faint glow of the mirrors. Mia's reflection stepped out of the glass, its form shimmering like static on a broken television. "You left me," the reflection said, its voice a distorted version of Mia's own. "You left me to die." Mia's blood ran cold. The reflection wasn't her, it was her brother, his face pale and his eyes filled with accusation. He had been lost to mental illness years ago, and Mia had always blamed herself for not being able to save him. "I'm sorry," Mia whispered, her voice breaking. "I tried." The reflection lunged at her, its hands clawing at her throat. Mia screamed, but no sound came out. The room spun around her, the whispers growing louder until they drowned out everything else. Jake moved cautiously, his scanner beeping furiously as he navigated the halls. The whispers grew louder, their voices overlapping into a deafening roar. He tried to focus on the scanner, but the screen flickered with static, the readings becoming increasingly erratic. He turned a corner and found himself in a small, windowless room. The walls were covered in names, carved into the plaster with jagged, uneven lines. Jake stepped closer, his flashlight illuminating the names. His heart stopped when he saw his own name among them. "What the hell?" Jake whispered, his voice trembling. The whispers grew louder, their voices overlapping into a single, guttural voice. "You belong to us now." Jake turned his flashlight toward the source of the voice, his beam illuminating a shadowy figure standing in the corner of the room. It was a patient, their face pale and their eyes hollow. They reached out a hand, their fingers twisted and broken. "Join us," the patient said, their voice filled with despair. Jake stumbled backward, his scanner slipping from his grasp. It hit the floor, the screen shattering into 1,000 pieces. The shadows closed in around him, their forms twisting and contorting into something unrecognizable. Sarah moved quickly, her camera clicking as she documented the horrors around her. The whispers grew louder, their voices overlapping into a cacophony of anger and despair. She tried to ignore them, but they grew more insistent with every step. She turned a corner and found herself in a chapel, its pews filled with shadowy figures. Their heads were bowed, their forms flickering like static on a broken television. Sarah raised her camera, snapping a photo. The flash illuminated the room, casting long shadows on the walls. When the light faded, the figures were gone. "What the hell?" Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. She turned to leave, but the doors slammed shut with a deafening crash. The whispers grew louder, their voices overlapping into a deafening roar. Sarah turned her flashlight toward the source of the noise, her beam illuminating a figure standing at the altar. It was Dr. Blackwood, his hollow eyes fixed on her. "You cannot leave," he said, his voice filled with malice. "You belong to us now." Sarah screamed, her camera slipping from her grasp. It hit the floor, the lens shattering into 1,000 pieces. The shadows closed in around her, their forms twisting and contorting into something unrecognizable. Mia, Jake, and Sarah found themselves back in the circular room, their faces pale with fear. The spiral symbol on the floor pulsed faintly, its lines jagged and uneven. The whispers grew louder, their voices overlapping into a deafening roar. "We need to get out of here," Mia said, her voice firm despite the terror gnawing at her. "How?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling. "This place is alive. It's not going to let us leave." Jake shook his head, his eyes filled with determination. "There has to be a way. We just need to find it." The group turned their flashlights toward the spiral symbol, its lines pulsing with an eerie light. They knew they had to destroy it, it was the only way to escape. But the asylum had other plans. The spiral symbol on the floor pulsed faintly, its jagged lines glowing with an eerie, otherworldly light. The whispers grew louder, their voices overlapping into a deafening roar. Mia, Jake, and Sarah stood in the center of the circular room, their flashlights cutting through the darkness as they tried to make sense of the horrors around them. "We need to destroy that symbol," Mia said, her voice firm despite the terror gnawing at her. "It's the only way to stop this." "How?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling. "We don't even know what it is." Jake knelt beside the symbol, his scanner beeping furiously. "It's some kind of conduit," he said, his eyes scanning the jagged lines. "Dr. Blackwood used it to trap souls here. If we can break it, we might be able to free them, and ourselves." Mia nodded, her mind racing. We need to find something to destroy it. A tool, a weapon, anything. The group turned their flashlights toward the walls, their beams illuminating rusted medical equipment and broken furniture. But before they could search further, the whispers stopped. The room fell silent, the air thick with tension. Then, from the darkness, came a single voice, a child's voice, soft and pleading. This way. Mia's blood ran cold. She turned her flashlight toward the source of the voice, her beam illuminating a small figure standing in the corner of the room. It was the same girl she had seen earlier, her dress tattered and her face pale. Her hollow eyes were filled with despair, but there was something else, a glimmer of hope. Who are you? Mia asked, her voice trembling. The girl didn't answer. She simply turned and walked down a nearby corridor, her form flickering like static on a broken television. We should follow her, Jake said, his voice filled with determination. Are you insane? Sarah hissed. She's one of them. She's trying to help us, Mia said, her eyes fixed on the girl. We don't have a choice. The group followed the girl down the corridor, their flashlights cutting through the darkness. The air grew colder with every step, their breath visible in the dim light. The whispers returned, their voices overlapping into a cacophony of anger and despair. The girl led them to a massive iron door, its surface covered in strange symbols. Above it, barely visible beneath layers of grime, was a sign, laboratory. This is it, Jake said, his voice filled with awe. This is where Dr. Blackwood conducted his experiments. Mia pushed the door open, its hinges screeching in protest. The air inside was thick with the scent of decay, the walls lined with shelves filled with jars of preserved organs. In the center of the room was a massive, spiral-shaped apparatus, its metal arms twisted like the branches of a dead tree. The girl vanished, her form dissolving into the shadows. What the hell is that? Sarah asked, her voice trembling. It's the machine, Jake said, his eyes scanning the apparatus. The one Dr. Blackwood used to merge the living with the dead. Mia stepped closer, her flashlight illuminating the machine. The spiral symbol was etched into its base, its lines jagged and uneven. The air around it seemed to shimmer, as if it were alive. We need to destroy it, Mia said, her voice firm. How? Sarah asked, her voice rising in panic. We don't even know how it works. Jake knelt beside the machine, his scanner beeping furiously. There's a power source, he said, his eyes scanning the jagged lines. If we can disconnect it, we might be able to shut it down. Before anyone could respond, the whispers stopped. The room fell silent, the air thick with tension. Then, from the darkness, came a single voice, a guttural voice, filled with malice. You cannot leave. You belong to us now. The group turned their flashlights toward the source of the voice, their beams illuminating Dr. Blackwood's ghostly figure. His hollow eyes fixed on them, his grotesque smile widening. We're not afraid of you, Mia said, her voice steady despite the terror gnawing at her. Dr. Blackwood laughed, the sound echoing in the silence. You should be. The shadows around them seemed to shift and twist, their forms taking on grotesque shapes. The group backed away, their flashlights cutting through the darkness as they tried to make sense of the horrors around them. We need to destroy the machine, Jake said, his voice filled with determination. It's the only way to stop him. Mia nodded, her mind racing. Sarah, help me find something to break it. Jake, keep him distracted. Jake stepped forward, his scanner beeping furiously. You're not going to win, he said, his eyes fixed on Dr. Blackwood. We're going to stop you. Dr. Blackwood laughed again, the sound filled with malice. You cannot stop what you do not understand. The shadows closed in around them, their forms twisting and contorting into something unrecognizable. The group knew they were running out of time. The laboratory was a nightmare come to life. The air was thick with the scent of decay, and the walls seemed to pulse faintly, as if the asylum itself were alive. Dr. Blackwood's ghostly figure loomed over the group, his hollow eyes fixed on them and his grotesque smile widening with every passing second. The shadows around them twisted and contorted, their forms taking on grotesque shapes that seemed to close in from all sides. Mia's heart pounded as she and Sarah frantically searched the room for something, anything, that could destroy the machine. Rusted tools, broken glass, and shattered equipment littered the floor, but nothing seemed strong enough to break the massive, spiral-shaped apparatus. "There has to be something here," Sarah hissed, her voice trembling as she overturned a table. A jar of preserved organs crashed to the floor, its contents spilling out in a pool of murky liquid. Mia's flashlight flickered, casting erratic beams of light across the room. Her eyes landed on a fire extinguisher mounted to the wall. It was old and rusted, but it was heavy, and it might just be enough. "Sarah, over here," Mia called, yanking the extinguisher from its mount. Meanwhile, Jake stood between the group and Dr. Blackwood, his scanner beeping furiously as he tried to keep the ghostly figure at bay. "You're not going to win," Jake said, his voice steady despite the fear gnawing at him. "We're going to stop you." Dr. Blackwood laughed, the sound echoing in the silence. "You cannot stop what you do not understand." The shadows around Jake seemed to shift, their forms twisting into grotesque figures that reached out with clawed hands. He stumbled backward, his scanner slipping from his grasp. It hit the floor, the screen shattering into 1,000 pieces. "Mia, hurry!" Jake shouted, his voice filled with panic. Mia and Sarah rushed toward the machine, the fire extinguisher clutched tightly in Mia's hands. The spiral symbol on the base of the apparatus pulsed faintly, its jagged lines glowing with an eerie light. "Do it!" Sarah urged, her voice trembling. Mia swung the extinguisher with all her strength, the metal clanging against the machine. The sound echoed in the silence, but the apparatus remained intact. "Again!" Sarah shouted. Mia swung again, and again, each strike sending sparks flying. The whispers grew louder, their voices overlapping into a deafening roar. The shadows around them seemed to close in, their forms twisting and contorting into something unrecognizable. Finally, with a deafening crack, the machine began to break apart. The spiral symbol on the floor flickered, its jagged lines fading in and out of existence. "It's working!" Jake shouted, his voice filled with relief. But Dr. Blackwood wasn't done. "You think you can destroy my life's work?" he snarled, his voice filled with malice. "You are nothing but insects, scurrying in the dark." The shadows around him seemed to solidify, their forms taking on grotesque shapes. The patients, those who had died under Dr. Blackwood's care, emerged from the darkness, their hollow eyes fixed on the group. "Mia, look out!" Sarah shouted, her voice filled with panic. Mia turned just in time to see a shadowy figure lunging at her. She swung the fire extinguisher, the metal connecting with the figure's head. It dissolved into smoke, but more figures emerged from the darkness, their forms twisting and contorting into something unrecognizable. "We need to get out of here!" Sarah screamed, her voice trembling. "Not yet!" Mia shouted, her voice firm despite the terror gnawing at her. "We need to destroy the symbol." She swung the extinguisher again, each strike sending sparks flying. The spiral symbol on the floor flickered, its jagged lines fading in and out of existence. But the shadows were closing in, their forms twisting and contorting into something unrecognizable. The group knew they were running out of time. The laboratory was in chaos. The air was thick with the scent of decay, and the walls seemed to pulse faintly, as if the asylum itself were alive. The spiral symbol on the floor flickered, its jagged lines fading in and out of existence as Mia swung the fire extinguisher with all her strength. "It's working!" Jake shouted, his voice filled with relief. But the shadows were closing in, their forms twisting and contorting into grotesque figures that reached out with clawed hands. The patients, those who had died under Dr. Blackwood's care, emerged from the darkness, their hollow eyes fixed on the group. We need to get out of here. Sarah screamed, her voice trembling. Not yet. Mia shouted, her voice firm despite the terror gnawing at her. We need to destroy the symbol. She swung the extinguisher again, each strike sending sparks flying. The spiral symbol on the floor flickered, its jagged lines fading in and out of existence. But Dr. Blackwood wasn't done. You think you can destroy my life's work? He snarled, his voice filled with malice. You are nothing but insects, scurrying in the dark. The shadows around him seemed to solidify, their forms taking on grotesque shapes. The patients, those who had died under Dr. Blackwood's care, emerged from the darkness, their hollow eyes fixed on the group. Mia, look out! Sarah shouted, her voice filled with panic. Mia turned just in time to see a shadowy figure lunging at her. She swung the fire extinguisher, the metal connecting with the figure's head. It dissolved into smoke, but more figures emerged from the darkness, their forms twisting and contorting into something unrecognizable. We need to get out of here. Sarah screamed, her voice trembling. Not yet. Mia shouted, her voice firm despite the terror gnawing at her. We need to destroy the symbol. She swung the extinguisher again, each strike sending sparks flying. The spiral symbol on the floor flickered, its jagged lines fading in and out of existence. But the shadows were closing in, their forms twisting and contorting into something unrecognizable. The group knew they were running out of time. With a final, deafening crack, the machine broke apart. The spiral symbol on the floor flickered, its jagged lines fading in and out of existence. The shadows around them seemed to dissolve, their forms twisting and contorting into something unrecognizable. But Dr. Blackwood wasn't done. You think you can destroy my life's work? He snarled, his voice filled with malice. You are nothing but insects, scurrying in the dark. The shadows around him seemed to solidify, their forms taking on grotesque shapes. The patients, those who had died under Dr. Blackwood's care, emerged from the darkness, their hollow eyes fixed on the group. Mia, look out! Sarah shouted, her voice filled with panic. Mia turned just in time to see a shadowy figure lunging at her. She swung the fire extinguisher, the metal connecting with the figure's head. It dissolved into smoke, but more figures emerged from the darkness, their forms twisting and contorting into something unrecognizable. We need to get out of here. Sarah screamed, her voice trembling. Not yet. Mia shouted, her voice firm despite the terror gnawing at her. We need to destroy the symbol. She swung the extinguisher again, each strike sending sparks flying. The spiral symbol on the floor flickered, its jagged lines fading in and out of existence. But the shadows were closing in, their forms twisting and contorting into something unrecognizable. The group knew they were running out of time.